Morning. So I want to talk a little more about basic D&D, the 1980 edition. This is the Tom Moldvay editor, I believe, is his title, known as the Moldvay Basic D&D. So I want to talk about one of the things that I think is so important to this version. Again, I don't know every single version of D&D. The two I was most exposed to growing up was this version and Mincer, of course, because Mincer came out, I think, in 83. So hot on the heels of Basic Expert, eventually Mincer. I don't recall us really making a big difference between the two. I think we obviously went to Mincer and started rolling up Karen using Mincer, but I was still running the game habitually, however I had been running the game. So again, they never really got whatever version we were running because I was running it however it worked for me to run it. So, but we enjoyed the books and we loved creating characters, and all that stuff. But okay. And again, I never used modules as written. I never used the guts of modules. Well, a little bit. Once in a while, I might use a room description or something. But for the most part, I threw out the guts and used the maps to walk them through dungeons. So again, I consider rules as written. If you're using a module, those are rules as written, right? So, which I don't do and haven't done, and doesn't say I wouldn't if I was to start today, right? But again, also, this is only about Moldvay basic D&D. I am not discussing all D20. I'm not interested in comparing basic Moldvay to Mincer. I'm not interested in comparing basic Dungeons and Dragons experience to the AD&D experience. I have zero interest in making an argument. I'm only talking about my favorite version, and the version I think, again, is perfect and complete in every way. And this one is race as class. And I'm gonna come at this from a few different angles. Mostly though the angle of again why I could care less. The argument that like modern D&D, all classes and all races are basically equal. They just do different things, right? Not too concerned about that, right? The thing I do enjoy about basic Moldvay is this quasi adherence to what we might see in literature. And so it's not like dwarves and elves and halflings are a different race than humans. They're a different species. And I think that's where we get some confusion. I prefer players to be making an actual different species, a different race, right? Separate from the human characters. And even the humans, for instance, the main characters, Aragorn, Gandalf, and Boromir in the trilogy, they're really, I think Boromir was straight human race, mixed anyway, but with a Dunedain. Aragorn was technically partially immortal Dunedain, right? So there was really nothing in basic D&D to represent a kind of quasi-immortal human, right? So I'll talk about that as I say. The next portion of this video is how would I run Lord of the Rings with basic D&D 1980, right? Okay. So personally, I think I like it when players are making an actual dwarf, right? And that dwarf doesn't just get bonuses. That dwarf has special abilities. That dwarf comes from a special culture, and hopefully they're going to adhere to some of that toward their character's role play, right? If basic D&D says they're stubborn and they're grumpy and they're greedy, I hope that players would choose a dwarf because they want to play a dwarf a little like that, right? Instead of taking dwarf and playing something completely different. Not saying you cannot, but it would be cool if you're going to adhere to the general fantasy of what D&D is. So I've said before, one of the things that makes basic D&D so cool is it is no set fantasy. You can't see my screen, can you? Whoops, let me go back to that. Let me go back here and I can screen share. It's general fantasy and derived from film and literature, right? And kind of the best way they could make it work in this class, race, level based system. And so I appreciate that subtle difference, but the dwarf is a different thing than the human as a fighter, right? The halfling is a different thing than the dwarf, the elf, and the human as a thief or whatever, right? So the halfling is not a halfling slash thief. The halfling is its own thing and it has its own abilities. Therefore, playing one is unique, right? So if I'm the only halfling in the party, I am completely unique. I'm not a halfling slash fighter, halfling slash thief. I'm the halfling. I might have some of those characteristics and some of those special abilities, et cetera, et cetera. And it's going to restrict what I can wear and what I can use. All of that is acceptable to me because I don't believe that we are, I'm 5'3". I can't reach the top shelf. Sorry as that, sad as that sounds, that's just life, right? I'm a 5'3" person. I need a step stool to get to the top shelf. That's just the way it is, right? This is the way we are. But I'm not a dwarf and I'm not a halfling, right? I'm not a different species than a human being. I'm just a short human. But the point is, we're not all equal, right? I mean, we're all equal, but we're not the same, right? Okay. So I like that uniqueness, that if somebody's playing a dwarf and they're the only dwarf in the party, there's a real uniqueness to that, right? If I'm the only cleric in the party, there's a real uniqueness to that, right? Yeah, the thief is not, again, if you don't make some of the prerequisites and you choose to be a fighter, you're not going to be the only one, right? And that's okay because soldiers, the fighting man, the soldier was pretty common, right? Okay. Everywhere you look in Lord of the Rings, there's some guy with a sword or a spear standing in the background. So they were pretty popular, right? So you shouldn't be the only fighter in the world, the only fighter in the party, and nor the only dwarf, etc. But if we were playing as a party, it's cool to see we all have that players could all have their unique spot, or in a way, unique role. And hopefully they role play it with some of the definitions described by the book. Personally, I'm okay with this because Lord of the Rings was my inspiration. It was my guide as to what dwarves were in their world and what elves were in that world and what halflings were in that world. And they were segregated, so to speak. They came together during times of war against an enemy. They came together. They came together during times of fighting with each other or fighting against something else. They might come together in like this Lord of the Rings. They come together in a common cause, to stop Saruman, to deliver the ring, right? But for the most part, they have their grievances with each other. They have their legacies, their cultural grievances, their cultural legacies. And I'm okay with all of that. And because that was my main exposure to fantasy, Moldvay made complete sense to me. Complete sense to me. Okay. So let's just look at some of this a little bit. I'll screen share here the book first. And I want to screen share. I will screen share the book first. Okay, so on page again, we're looking at page B9 and B10, right? We're looking at dwarves. Dwarves are short, so they define them. They tell you roughly how big they are, and they even tell you roughly their personality, what their prime requisite should be to be a dwarf. You have to have a 13 or better to get those bonus experience points. It doesn't mean you can't be a dwarf without it, but with the 13 or greater strength, you would get that experience bonus of plus 5% earned in your campaigning. So again, what I talked about earlier in the first video, everything is tied together. If you don't use experience points and you don't use treasure, then the guy with the 13 plus strength isn't getting that bonus where he can level up a little faster than the dwarf that's a 9 strength. But you could still be a dwarf with a 9 strength. You're just not going to get the bonus, right? Okay. They tell you what they use for their hit points and how the maximum level they can go. And of course, their minimum prerequisite, Constitution. So you couldn't be a dwarf if you don't make at least Constitution 9, right? So if you roll up your character, you want to be a dwarf, and you roll up a 7 Constitution, you're going to want to re-roll him, or you're going to want to swap him with somebody else at the table, right? Hey, take my 7 score guy. I want that 9 so I can be a dwarf, whatever. You could trade, or just tear it up and roll up another character. And then it defines how this species of creature is different than others, right? Doesn't mean there aren't others with infravision, etc. But that's what's so cool about it. You're playing this thing, and I see him as a different species, not a different race, so to speak, right? On this planet, we're all human beings. Culturally, we may be different. Regionally, we may be different, and of course, we use the term race to define certain characteristics. But the reality is, we're all the same species. We're all human beings. And the term race is to distinguish between a culture or a region of the world or something like that, right? But outside of that, we're all the same. We are all actually the same. We're all human beings. There might be, I guess there could be some human being in the world that could be born with infravision, right? I mean, that would be superhero-esque stuff. But in reality, right, not going to be the case generally, right? But my point is, they are different creatures, right? And I like that. I like it separating it, because what we don't end up with this weird kind of where an elf can be a magic user and a fighter. No, the elf is what he is, and he gets spells along with his ability to wear certain armor, do certain things. This is Legolas, right? The dwarf is Gimli, and the fighters are, of course, Aragorn and Boromir, etc. And then we get the halflings, which are the only halflings we know in literature, in the history of literature, are quite literally invented, which is why they're not called hobbits in this game, because hobbits were a thing, right? Intellectual property. The halfling is what we only know from the literature I've ever read anyway, as far as pertaining to something like Dungeons and Dragons fantasy, right? Would be the hobbits from the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, right? And then our magic users, of course, would be Merlin, Gandalf, et cetera, right? Okay. So I'm okay with that. And I actually think it's important, because I can be a human who specializes as a priest, right? Dale can be a human that specializes in thievery, right? Jose can be a human that specializes in fighting. But then we could still have a elf and a halfling in the group with a dwarf, all completely unique. And I dig that. It makes for varied choices and options, right? And they all have special abilities, so to speak. So I dig that. I don't know why they went away from that, right? Because people want to play an elf bard or an elf priest or an elf whatever. For what D&D claims it is, you're adventuring into dungeons to do a thing. I'm okay with there not being elf doctors, right? Or elf priests or elf bards, right? The elf that's going to do this kind of adventuring is a particular kind of elf. It may not be every elf in the world, but they wouldn't be doing this particular thing if they weren't these kinds of people. The cleric goes out to rid the world of evil. Thieves go out to make a bundle because they had no other options. And fighters, of course, are the muscle and the guys who are capable of defending or offensively affecting the party's ability to fight, so to speak, right? And the magic user may be going out in the world to acquire more magic, to learn more things, right? So they all make sense in the tropes that are Dungeons and Dragons. They're the tropes of that early literature, the least that I was exposed to. The only other literature I've read fantasy-wise, outside of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, was Conan, right? That's it. There's no other fantasy literature as far as swords and sorcery, etc. for me. Those were the things that I read and appreciated and stuck to, right? So, and there's a lot of fantasy novels out there, clearly, that I'm ignorant of, and that maybe D&D, this also represents those things well, right? Like the cleric is fascinating to me. The cleric to me comes out of the cleric to me almost seems a staple of Bram Stoker, right? The guy wielding a cross in Holy Water, right? I don't recollect any clerics in Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, and in Conan, right? The cleric type person. But clerics, certainly, I instantly recognized them when I read it as a kid. They're my favorite class. So the idea of some cross-wielding zealot that can banish away skeletons and vampires, et cetera, clearly comes from literature as well as film, right? Okay. Anyway, that's enough about that, but I want to talk about it a little bit, right? And how it works in this and why it's so special. They're all unique individuals. This picture proves what their intent and design was. This guy's different than this girl, that's different than this guy, that's different than this guy, that's different than this guy, that's different than this guy. They are all unique. And that's not an elf cleric, that's not also an elf fighter, that's not also an elf, right? A magic user, right? So it's something very, very much deterministic about what they wanted you to do and be and represent. And I dig that, right? I dig those things. I won't get into alignment in this, but I also love alignment. I like alignment. I've used alignment. I also use alignment languages. Makes total sense to me. Makes complete sense to me that I might be able to speak a particular language to my lawful comrades and have trouble understanding chaotic creatures and their speech. Total makes sense to me. So I dig it, right? I dig that. So anyway, so that's that. Now I wanted to share, let me stop sharing this. And then I thought I would talk about how would this look? if I was to say that I'm only playing basic D&D, which means level 3 is the max. We're not going to go up to expert and drive up the charts. We're not going to move into advanced D&D. And I said to my group before we started games or campaign, we're going to use basic Dungeons and Dragons Moldvay only. Those rules only. Don't look anywhere else. Don't plan on being a 12th level dwarf. 3 is going to be your max. So that with the players understanding that, they really do understand their relevance at level 3 to what's in the book and the dangers of the world and what they need to do or achieve, right? It really does it grounds them to their maximum abilities. Therefore, they've got to understand other options, right? So let's just say basic D&D 1980, assuming basic is the beginning and the end of one's campaigning, max level 3. What would the 9 look like if basic D&D was the only game rules used? So what would the 9 look like if you were going to play Lord of the Rings using racist class and max level 3? Well, Aragorn would be a human fighter, level 3. Gandalf would be a human magic user, level 3. Boromir would be a human fighter, level 2. Legolas would be an elf, level 2. Gimli would be a dwarf, level 2. Frodo would be a halfling, level 2, with charisma 13 plus, because you might want to make Sam, Pippin, and Merry retainers. They would fall as baggage handlers or retainers for Frodo. So you would need at least 13 plus charisma to represent his bonus and their morale kick, right? They really cared for Frodo. They really wanted to help Frodo, and they were pretty stout, willing to defend Frodo. So I would say you would have to be a 13 plus to make sense in the literature, right? Sam, of course, though, Sam, Pippin, and Merry would all be halfling level 1s outside of that. So if you were to literally get 9 people together and say, hey, we want to play that group in Lord of the Rings, not Lord of the Rings the story, but we want to play this group, somebody would take Aragorn, human fighter level 3, Gandalf, right? And there would have to be people in the group that would be Merry, Pippin, and Sam at halflings level 1, right? Then I thought, well, what would the Hobbit look like, right? Well, Bilbo would be a level 1 because he literally was had never done anything. So he's a level 1 halfling. His charisma should be 9 plus because I think the other main characters were Thorin and Balin. Now, Gandalf was there at the beginning, but ultimately Gandalf is almost an NPC. But so let's say we wanted to play using this set of bodies. I think there would be one PC, Bilbo, a PC playing Thorin the Dwarf, level 3 with a charisma of 18. He is the king, and he would have at least 7 dwarf followers at high morale. That would be the other hobbits, or the other dwarves. Balin, who was also really Thorin's right-hand man, Thorin's guider, right, his advisor, and level 2 for him, charisma 13 plus, to make up for the other, again, the other dwarves that would not fall under Thorin's charisma. So with an 18, you can have 7 retainers, right? That means there's 4 other dwarfs that wouldn't be Balin that you would want to fall under the retainer. So then all the other Hobbit dwarves, the other 10 would be retainers that would fall under Thorin and Balin's purview, right? And then Bilbo, again, at level 1 halfling. So we have 2 dwarfs, level 3 for Thorin with a high charisma, Balin, level 2 with a charisma of 13 plus, and then the other dwarves would all be retainers, right? And then I thought, what the heck? Let's look at Conan. What would Conan be based on what's available in D&D? I would say Conan a thief level 3. You could go Conan human fighter level 3, right? But again, remember, if we're using basic D&D only, the maximal level would be 3, right? And that's why you think, well, Conan certainly finishes a king. Oh, of course, that would be, we go on to expert D&D, level 9, level 12, with a stronghold. That's King Conan. But Conan thief level 3 makes the most sense for me. And the reason I say thief is he rarely wore armor beyond leathers, right? And then I thought, well, what about one of my favorite TV shows, The Last Kingdom, Uhtred? He would be a human fighter, and again, level 3 if we're getting to Uhtred, the later years of Uhtred's legacy, right? Early on, of course, Uhtred would have been a level 1, or Zero turned hero, right? As they murdered his surrogate family, and he and his both of them were, he and the girl, slaves, ran away. You could argue Uhtred was like level 0.5 to 1. But again, where would his maximum be once we get deeper into his stories? Level 3, right? Max. But I thought that's kind of how I would break down why race as class makes sense. And if you were to play only 1980 basic D&D as your complete rule set, again, sticking with this idea that it's a complete system, right? What could they look like if you were to start off campaigning with these guys, or where would Aragorn finish, right? They could all potentially finish at level 3. But if I were to say to players, we're going to play the 9, our own Lord of the Rings story, I would pass out these characters at a table of people, and they would have to choose who do they want to play, right? So that's just an idea. But again, the series of videos on basic D&D circa 1980-81, that's the Tom Moldvay edition. He was the editor. Again, for me, it's the single best D&D book. Certainly, Mincer was darn good. The art in Mincer is phenomenal, but I don't think Mincer is even as well written and as well crafted as the Moldvay version. And of course, AD&D, I had a couple of the books. We cannibalized things for those books, but I never played it, I never ran it, and I never paid any hard attention to AD&D, so I cannot speak to AD&D. I know there's multi-classing, and now you can be a monk, an assassin, and they started adding all that stuff that to me lost its focus on what? It didn't lose its focus. It changed, AD&D changed the focus of the kind of fantasy gaming that players could enjoy. Let's put it that way. It didn't lose its focus. It changed the focus. The basic games really, to me, were focused. They were really focused on a certain type of gaming, mostly dungeon crawls, obviously, because there's not a lot of overland travel rules. There's not any until you get to expert. So there's not a lot of wilderness adventure rules in this. There's not a lot of stronghold building rules. So this basic D&D was about going into the depths of the darkest dungeons, right? Think of basic D&D 1980 as the game. It could have been called Moria, Adventures in Moria, right? It could have literally been make your characters are going into the mines of Moria, right? In a way, that's how I kind of see it. Anyway, thanks for watching. I may have a couple other videos I want to do about this particular game, this particular book, this particular edition, and I may talk more about it. But these were the two most important. One, I want to talk about why all those rules make a system and they all make the game function. And then I want to talk about something that people seem to have a real issue with, race as class. And I love race as class, or I should say species as class. There are humans and these things they do, and then there are dwarfs, and in their entirety, that's what a dwarf is and an elf is. We know that in reality, somewhere in their elven kingdoms, there's probably an elf cleric. There's probably an elf, doctor, right? There's probably an elf, but for all intents and purposes, that's not who's going on to these adventures. Legolas was not a cleric, right? Legolas joined the crew to do a particular job because he had capabilities, and that's what he did for the group, right? Gimli as well, etc. Anyway, thanks a lot for listening. Everybody have a great day. Bye.